Hello everyone, and welcome to War in Middle-earth, a series where I take you through all of the major wars and conflicts throughout the history of Middle-earth, from the First Age to the Fourth Age. In this episode, we look at the Battle of the Five Armies, the penultimate major conflict of the Third Age, and the battle that would change the face of the north of Middle-earth for the remaining years to come. This battle would be the final time the armies of dwarves, elves, and men would fight side by side on the battlefield. 2 episodes ago, we focused mainly on the wars that the dwarves experienced in the last third of the Third Age. The last and most devastating of these wars was the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, which would end in a dwarven victory, but see countless dead on either side. Following this, Thrain, now king of Durin's folk, and Thorin Oakenshield, his son, would return briefly to Dunland, before eventually making their way to the southern Blue Mountains in 2802. Dwarves had lived in the Blue Mountains since the beginning of their race, so Thrain was able to make a reasonable living in his new halls. However, it could not compare to the wealth of the Lonely Mountain, which began to consume Thrain's thoughts. This culminated in 2841. Thrain left the Blue Mountains with a small group, seemingly intent on returning to the Lonely Mountain. For 4 years they travelled, constantly harassed by orcs, wolves, and other evil creatures, and whilst camped under the eaves of Mirkwood, Thrain simply disappeared one night. His companions looked for him, but could not find him. Unknown to them, Thrain had been abducted by servants of the Necromancer, and had been taken to Dol Guldur, where the last of the 7 dwarven rings was taken from him. Speaking of the Necromancer, Sauron of course, his influence had grown great in the northern lands of Middle-earth. Some, such as Gandalf, were highly suspect of the Necromancer's identity. He had attempted to discover this back in 2063, but the Necromancer had fled. This time, in 2850, Gandalf managed to sneak into the pits of Dol Guldur. There, he found a dwarf, mad and raving from years of torture, so addled that he couldn't even remember his own name. Before dying of his hurts, he gave to Gandalf a map and a key. From this venture, Gandalf discovered that the Necromancer was, unsurprisingly, Sauron, and he immediately returned to the White Council to urge for an immediate assault. Saruman, the leader of the White Council, was against this proposal, as he believed that his best chances of finding the One Ring came from monitoring the movements of Sauron's servants. Due to this inaction, for the next 90 years, Sauron's power continued to grow, whilst his enemies weakened. Gandalf was especially concerned about the north of Middle-earth. The loss of Erebor and of Dale meant that Sauron's only powerful foes in the north were the dwarves of the Iron Hills, considering that the elves of Mirkwood were rather isolationist. If Sauron had access through the northern lands, he could potentially refound the kingdom of Angmar, and the weakened northern lands would be ripe for the taking. What's more is that Gandalf was concerned about the presence of Smaug, and what harm could befall if Sauron and Smaug managed to strike an alliance. By 2939, the situation had begun to alarm even Saruman, who noticed that Sauron's servants had begun to zero in on the Gladden Fields, although neither of them knew that Gollum had the One Ring. By chance, in the year of 2941, Gandalf met Thorin Oakenshield in Bree, and Thorin, inviting Gandalf back to his own halls, spoke of his plight. Both had the same idea. The Lonely Mountain needed to be retaken, and Smaug needed to be destroyed. Both had different planned methods though. Thorin advocated force, whereas Gandalf advocated stealth. Neither of them had much hope, but the plan inspired Gandalf to enlist the aid of a hobbit, one Bilbo Baggins. It wasn't until Gandalf reached the Shire did he realise that the dying dwarf in Dol Guldur was in fact Thrain II, and the map and key were exactly what Thorin needed to gain secret entry to Erebor. So began the events of The Hobbit. Thorin and his company, Balin, Dwalin, Oin, Gloin, Fili, Kili, Dori, Nori, Ori, Biffa, Boffa, and Bomba travelled eastward alongside Gandalf and Bilbo. I'll only speak of the most important events, as the rest can be found in The Hobbit. Upon travelling through the High Pass, Thorin and his company, minus Gandalf and Bilbo, are abducted by orcs from Goblin Town. During this disaster, Bilbo stumbles across a little something called the One Ring, and meets Gollum. The dwarves escape with the help of Gandalf, killing the Great Goblin, presumably the ruler of Goblin Town, in the process. The dwarves then continue eastwards and meet Beorn, before eventually setting off into Mirkwood. Here they leave Gandalf behind. He has other business. Saruman, increasingly paranoid about Sauron finding the One Ring, concedes and gives approval for an attack on Dol Guldur. The scale of this attack, whether it's just the members of the White Council or whether it involved forces from Lothlorien and Rivendell, is unknown, but the outcome is that Sauron flees. This isn't due to weakness, he was planning on moving anyway, back to Mordor, which has been under the control of his servants for 1,000 years. Meanwhile, the dwarves have a run-in with spiders and are captured by the Elves of Mirkwood, but eventually escape to Esgaroth, Lake Town. This is the closest settlement to Erebor, and where many of the survivors of Dale fled to following Smaug's arrival. The Lake Men were eager to aid the dwarves, seeing it as the return of the legendary King Under the Mountain. The company reaches Erebor and Bilbo sneaks in, where he is confronted by Smaug. Although Bilbo does pretty well when face to face with a giant man-eating dragon, he lets slip the term Barrel Rider. This catches Smaug's attention. He's very aware of the men of Lake Town and their trade, done largely with floating barrels. Realizing that Bilbo and the dwarves, who he is also aware of due to the presence of multiple ponies in the area, must have had help from the Lake Men, he decides that they must be taught a lesson. Bilbo escapes, but Smaug flies off in the direction of Esgaroth. Due to the perception of Bard, a descendant of Girion, Lord of Dale, the Lake Men manage some small preparation before the dragon arrives. The bridge between Esgaroth and the shore is pulled down, the women and children are loaded into boats, and anyone able is armed with bows and arrows. The master of Lake Town loads his boat with whatever treasures he has and also tries to flee. Unable to cross into the town and unable to land in the water, Smaug begins strafing the town with fire, which many of the citizens attempt to put out. A company of archers, led by Bard, pepper Smaug again and again as he flies by, but none of the arrows can pierce his hide. Just when all hope is lost, a thrush informs Bard that Smaug has a weak spot, and with his final arrow, the Black Arrow, Bard manages to shoot down Smaug, and he falls into the town in his death throes. The survivors from the town reach the western shore, including Bard and the Master. Surprisingly, despite the destruction of their town, 3/4 of Esgaroth's population manages to survive the attack. The survivors proclaim Bard king, but are talked down by both Bard and the Master, whose chief concerns are with housing and feeding the population. By the 5th day following Smaug's downfall, some of those who escaped from Smaug, even uninjured, had perished to either exposure or sickness. Word of Smaug's death begins to spread across Middle-earth, and some, such as the Elves of Mirkwood, witness the entire thing through their far-seeing eyes of their scouts. Help soon arrived for the Lake Men. King Thranduil had immobilized immediately, and was about to march north to claim Erebor when Bard's messengers arrived, begging for aid. Thranduil isn't really a dick in the books like he is in the films, so he diverts his course to the ruins of Lake Town, where his people begin to help feeding and sheltering the survivors. Shortly afterwards, Thranduil's army, as well as the forces gathered by Bard, begin their march north to Erebor. Bard, in particular, is determined to have some hand in the treasure, as compensation for the Lake Men's aiding of the dwarves, as well as their suffering at the hands of Smaug. However, it's also worth mentioning that both Thranduil and Bard are convinced that Thorin's company is likely dead at this point, probably having been the first victims of the dragon's rage. This is not the case. From the Raven, Rak, son of Kark, Thorin learns that Smaug is dead, and that the elves and Lake Men are on their way to the mountain with intent of claiming the treasure. This enrages Thorin, who tells the ravens to fly east, west, and north to call together any dwarves that might be found. His chief hopes lie with Dane Ironfoot, Lord of the Iron Hills, who is less than 2 weeks' march from Erebor. Sure enough, Dane immediately gathers 500 soldiers, many of them veterans from the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, and orders a forced march towards Erebor. Shortly after their arrival at the Lonely Mountain, Bard and Thranduil attempt to negotiate with Thorin, who has barricaded himself inside Erebor. Bard puts forth a claim on the treasure based on the following facts. Many of the treasures in Erebor originally belonged to Dale, which Smaug also stole from. Bard slew the dragon, the Lake Men had helped the dwarves reach Erebor, and that Smaug had destroyed much of Esgaroth due to the meddling of the dwarves. Thorin is completely unreceptive to this, especially whilst a host of elves is camped outside the mountain, who he claims have no rightful claim on the treasure, which he isn't really wrong about. However, Bard does not trust Thorin, and he is also aware of the imminent arrival of Dane Ironfoot, so he isn't planning on dismissing the elves. His official terms are that Thorin must deliver 1/12 of the mountain's fortune to Dale, and if he wishes to have the friendship of the Lake Men, he must deliver some of his own wealth. Thorin responds by shooting an arrow at the speaker. Negotiations continue fruitlessly for the next week, during which time Bilbo steals the Arkenstone and delivers it to Bard so he can increase his bargaining power. This simply enrages Thorin, and it's possible he might have killed Bilbo if not for the intervention of Gandalf, who has arrived following the events at Dol Guldur. Dane's vanguard also arrives, but Bard refuses to let them pass, correctly guessing that the dwarves would simply cease negotiations once the mountain was sufficiently manned. Dane's main force arrives shortly afterwards, and continues towards the mountain unperturbed. Bard thinks they're idiots, as he has forces positioned on the spurs of the mountains ready to ambush the dwarves, but Thranduil talks him down momentarily. Despite that, the battle is about to be joined when something unexpected happens. A dark cloud suddenly appears above Erebor from the north, heralding a storm. Except it wasn't just a cloud, it was a horde of bats, and beneath them marched an army of orcs and wargs, drawn from the Misty Mountains and the Grey Mountains, led by Bolg, son of Azog. The death of the Great Goblin had enraged them, and they had already mobilized when word of Smaug's death reached them. They now had a chance to visit revenge upon their enemies, as well as claim a mountain full of treasures. From Gundabad, they had marched eastwards, moving swiftly by night so that not even the ravens had seen them approaching. They were now set to loot the mountain from the northeast, catching their enemies almost entirely by surprise. At Gandalf's urging, the leaders of the three armies take counsel and devise a plan. Lure Bolg's army in between the eastern and southern spur of the mountain, the southern spur actually more appearing to be a western spur. Once in the valley, the orcs could be ambushed by the allied forces, which would remain in hiding on both spurs until the last moment. On the eastern spur were stationed the dwarves under Dane and the lakemen under Bard, and on the southern spur and on Ravenhill were stationed Thranduil's elves, as well as Bilbo and Gandalf. The numbers for the battle are somewhat known. The elves numbered at least 1,000 spearmen and at least several hundred archers. The dwarves numbered at least 500, possibly a little more. The number of lakemen is unknown, possibly numbering as little as a few hundred, or perhaps as many as 1,000. Thorin's company of 13 also remains inside the mountain. The number of orcs and wargs is unknown. Given the weakening of the mountain orcs only 140 years earlier, it's unlikely that their army was huge, yet it was still large enough to pose a significant threat. I'd think it likely over 10,000, but probably not as high as 15,000. For anyone wondering as to why the elves and dwarves sent so few, Tolkien doesn't really give us a canon explanation. The only one I can offer is that both Dane and Thranduil had to gather their soldiers in haste, as although we don't have the exact timeline, people smarter than I have calculated that the time between Smaug's death and the Battle of Five Armies was about 2 to 3 weeks. Although Thranduil had less distance to travel, he would have had to have left fighters at home considering the inherent dangers of Mirkwood, and in Dane's case, he had to move almost immediately if he wanted to reach the mountain before Thorin and his company were possibly overwhelmed. The battle starts with the vanguard of Orcish Wolf and Warg Riders moving into the valley. There, a small force of Bard's bravest men opposes them, their orders to provide enough resistance to lure the bulk of Bolg's forces into the valley. This they do, taking heavy casualties before fleeing into the arms of the mountain. Behind them, Bolg's army surges into the valley, seeking the rest of their enemies. Once enough of the orcs were gathered in the valley, Thranduil's elves loosed a volley of arrows and charged their enemies, taking the orcs by surprise and breaking their ranks. Just as the orcs begin to recover from the sudden assault, the dwarves and men charged from the other side, causing the elves to renew their own assault. Mere minutes into the battle, and some orcs were already breaking and fleeing south down the river, whilst their own wolves turned on them, killing the wounded and eating the dead. Despite the disastrous start, Bolg was not about to be undone. He had gathered many of his soldiers to scale the mountain from the north, and these began to appear just as the battle was turning against him. These orcs started streaming down onto the spurs of the mountain from above, and although some fell to their deaths, they swiftly started to overwhelm the few defenders that remained to block them. Seeing the tide turning, the orcs in the valley surged forward once again, led by a host of wargs and Bolg's personal guards. Bats descended upon the allies, swirling about their heads and attacking those that were wounded. In that moment, a trumpet call came from Erebor's gate. The barricade collapsed, and out came Thorin and his company, dressed for battle. The sight of Thorin Oakenshield inspired many of the defenders, and both elves and men, as well as all of the dwarves, charged back down into the valley to aid Thorin's onslaught. This onslaught went well at first, piling the corpses of orcs and wargs. Yet their own numbers dwindled too, and as the valley widened, they reached Bolg and his personal guard, and could not continue any further. Bolg then counterattacked, from both the valley and the mountain above, and soon, Thorin and his inspired soldiers were surrounded on the floor of the valley. They can receive no further aid from either of the spurs, as the elves and men still positioned there are struggling to hold their own positions. On Raven Hill, Bilbo's outlook is bleak, and it seems like they're all doomed to die there. He laments that all of his friends and allies are about to be killed. But just as all seems lost, the dark clouds to the west open with the rays of the sunset. And out of the opening comes many eagles, who have witnessed the orc hordes and have arrived just in time to help. Speaking of Bilbo, he's our primary source for the battle, and at this point he is knocked out by a stone thrown from atop the mountain. Everything beyond this point he learns secondhand. However, we still know some of what happens whilst Bilbo is KO'd. The eagles swoop down, dislodging the orcs who remained on the mountain, killing them or casting them off into the valley below. Which is the same as killing them, just letting gravity do the work. With the orcs on the mountain destroyed, those elves and men on the spurs are free to rejoin the battle in the valley. Despite this, they are still outnumbered, and the battle is still poised. This changes after the sudden and unexpected arrival of Beorn. He smashes through the rear of the enemy and reaches those surrounded in the valley. There, Thorin Oakenshield has been grievously wounded by many spears, so Beorn bears him to safety. Then he returns and charges straight towards Bolg, ripping apart his bodyguards and eventually crushing the orc chieftain to death. This is the final blow to the orcs, and with the loss of their leader, they flee wildly in every direction, pursued by the survivors. They are driven into the river running or into the marshlands near to the ruins of Esgaroth, where most of them are killed. Some few make it to Mirkwood, where they are killed by the elves, or die in the unfamiliar tangle of the forest. The casualties for the battle are presumably heavy on both sides. It was estimated following the battle that 3/4 of the orcs of the north had been killed in the battle, effectively ending them as a major force for the rest of the Third Age. The elves, men, and dwarves also take heavy casualties, but perhaps the most important casualties of all were that of Thorin Oakenshield, who dies of his wounds, as well as that of his nephews, Fili and Kili. In his final moments, Thorin Oakenshield repents his greed and wishes Bilbo a good life. Despite the deaths of Thorin and his nephews, a lot of good comes from the battle. Dain II Ironfoot becomes the new king of Durin's folk, and with the Lonely Mountain free again, he re-establishes the kingdom of Erebor. Fairer of thought and wiser of mind than his cousin, Dain distributes the wealth of the mountain amongst Thorin's companions, but also to the people of Lake Town. Bard is proclaimed as the first king of Dale, which he rebuilds using his newly acquired wealth. He also gives some of this to the Master of Lake Town, who, unfortunately, goes crazy with greed and runs off and starves to death in the wilderness, for some reason. Despite this, Esgaroth is still rebuilt north of its original position, and it becomes part of Bard's kingdom. Further west, Beorn returns home after his success in battle. With the almost total annihilation of the mountain orcs, the men of the Vales of Anduin have peace for decades, and many of them unite under Beorn's leadership. In Mirkwood, the necromancer has fled to parts unknown, and although the forests are not safe, the presence of evil in the north once again recedes. This, however, is simply the calm before the storm. Sauron has indeed fled, but his destination is far closer than the wise would prefer, and unknown to all except for a single hobbit, the One Ring has returned to the civilized world after being lost for nearly 3,000 years, at the bottom of a river and in the hands of a creature named Gollum. War is now fast approaching, but thanks to the victory at the Battle of the Five Armies, the Three Peoples are in a stronger position to face it. Whether they're strong enough, only time will tell. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. The Battle of the Five Armies is a preview of things to come, as we're able to get much closer and much more personal to the future battles of the Third Age. The War of the Ring is next. I've so far planned at least 9 episodes, all super detailed, and hopefully better than any of the episodes I've released so far. Thanks again, cheers, farewell, and remember, if you have a lot of wealth, don't tell anyone, otherwise you'll probably have to share it. Also, learn to tax evade.